Down there, life continues. The traffic is awful, stocks go on trading, and Star Trek is still showing.
Good day, grade 8 learners. Welcome to today's Natural Sciences lesson. My name is Pathuchetso Singo, and this lesson is proudly brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education. In today's lesson, we're going to be learning under a new topic. The topic is microorganisms. And the subtopic, which is our area of focus, is types of microorganisms and harmful microorganisms. Now, let's go through the lesson objectives for today's lesson. So, at the end of the day, you should be able to define microorganism, describe different microorganisms, and describe harmful microorganisms, describe how microorganisms cause diseases, describe how diseases are spread, and discuss various effective measures of preventing the spread of diseases. All this is sourced from the CAPS document on page 39. Now let's move on to the pre-knowledge slide. In grade 7, we were introduced to classification of living things, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then lastly, species. So we were introduced to the classification. Now let's move on to the baseline assessment. Right, it is a question which involves a table. So we need to fill in the empty spaces in the table below. Right, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes to fill in the empty spaces in the table below. So see you after 5 minutes. Welcome back, grade 8 learners. Don't forget to send in your responses or any questions that you might have to the number at the bottom of the screen, which is 079 Now let's go through the corrections together. Now we needed to fill in the empty spaces in the table below. So the table contained domains and kingdoms. So on this column here, we've got domain, kingdom, and characteristics. So you needed to fill in the spaces where there's a space in the kingdom, and where there's spaces in the characteristics. Okay, so under the domain bacteria, the kingdom is also bacteria, and the characteristics of the living organisms that fall under this domain, they are simple unicellular organisms. So if you wrote that, give yourself a mark. And then under the domain archaea, the kingdom is archaea. These organisms are simple unicellular organisms that live in extreme environments. By extreme environments, maybe we mean in high temperatures or very low temperatures, or maybe a place that is acidic or alkaline. And then under the kingdom protista, the characteristics of the organisms, they are also unicellular like archaea and bacteria, but there is a slight difference. They are more complex. They are more complex than archaea and bacteria. And then under the domain eukarya, we had left a space here. So fungi are unicellular and multicellular and absorb food. And then under kingdom plantae, these organisms are multicellular and they can make their own food. And then under this organisms with the characteristics of multicellular and can make their food fall under the kingdom animalia. Right, so give yourself a quick 2 minutes to copy down the corrections, and then see you after 2 minutes. Welcome back. Let's continue with our lesson. Now we're moving on to terminology. So these are the terms that we're going to come across during the course of the lesson. So they're going to, knowing their meanings or their definitions will help us to better understand what we're going to learn today. So the first term is microorganism. Microorganism, they are living organisms that are too small to see with the naked eye. So we call them microorganisms. And then virus, this is a very simple microorganism that is dependent on a host for survival. And then bacteria, these are microorganisms that are made up of one cell. Protists are unicellular complex microorganisms. They are unicellular complex microorganisms. And then fungi, this is a group of microorganisms that are unicellular and multicellular. So some of them within this group are multicellular and some of them are unicellular. And then magnify. Magnify means to make something to appear larger than its actual size. And then unicellular means consisting of one cell. Consisting of one cell. And then multicellular means consisting of many cells. So that is what unicellular and multicellular mean. And then infect means contaminate with harmful organisms. Contaminate with harmful organisms. Now, waterborne disease, this is a disease that is caused by contact with water contaminated with certain microorganisms. Then diarrhea, this is when you have a runny stomach and it can lead to dehydration. It can lead to dehydration. And then pathogens, these are microorganisms that cause diseases. These are microorganisms that cause diseases. Right, let's learn about microorganisms. So we've already defined microorganisms in terminology, but let's learn more about them. So microorganisms have been on Earth for many years and have adapted to live in extreme conditions. Remember when we were learning about protists, about archaea, that they are unicellular organisms that live in extreme conditions. And in our previous lessons, we've been learning about adaptations when the conditions of an environment changes, and the living organisms that are in that particular ecosystem or environment adapt in order to survive. So, because they've adapted to live in extreme environments, we find them in almost all the areas in the biosphere, and new microorganisms are still being discovered all the time, and some can be harmful while others are useful to us and are a vital part of our ecosystems. Now, how do we see the microorganisms, or how do scientists see these microorganisms? They use what is called a microscope, because most organisms are not visible with the naked eye. They are microscopic. So the only time we can be able to see them is by using a microscope or in a micrograph. So this is what a microscope looks like. So people use microscopes in order to see the smallest organisms that we cannot see with the naked eye. So they use a microscope. Now there are different kinds of microorganisms. Remember, our subtopic has two parts. There's types of microorganisms and there's harmful microorganisms. So now we're going to cover the first part, which is types of microorganisms. So there are different kinds of microorganisms, and here they are. Firstly, we have what are called viruses. We have what are called viruses. What are they? So viruses are microorganisms that cannot carry out the 7 life processes on their own. So they tend to hijack other organisms, and the hijacked organism then is called a host. So these are very small organisms that we cannot see with the naked eye. We use a microscope to see them. They cannot carry out the 7 life processes, so they use other organisms to do so. So they have both living organism characteristics and non-living characteristics. The next type of microorganism that is there is bacteria. Bacteria are unicellular microorganisms. They are made up of one cell. So the entire bacterium is made up of one cell. Okay, and then we have fungi. They are subdivided into multicellular and unicellular organisms. Examples of fungi is mushrooms, mold, toadstool. These also fall under fungi. I'm sure you've seen a mushroom before. So this is the type of fungi that is multicellular and can be seen with a naked eye. And then we have what are called protists. These are like bacteria. They are made of one cell, but they are more complex. They are more complex. Okay, now let's learn about each and every one of the microorganisms that I've just introduced you to. We'll start off with bacteria. So bacteria are living things that are neither plant no animals. So we cannot classify them as plants and we cannot classify them as animals. Now, they belong to the kingdom called Monera. They belong to the kingdom called Monera. I'm sure you remember from your grade 7. And all bacteria are unicellular, although some of them live in groups, and these groups are called colonies. So we call that colony multicellular because it no longer has one bacteria, rather it has more than one. So we call a colony multicellular. So they live in what are called colonies. Now, scientists differentiate bacteria in different ways, and one of these ways is how they are structured, their structure and or their shape. Some bacteria are called spheres or cocci because they have a spherical shape. And an example of such is the Staphylococcus aureus, and then some are rod-shaped. We call these the rods, the bacilli. And an example is the Salmonella typhi, the one that causes salmonella. It is a rod-shaped bacteria. And then we've got the spirals. These ones have a spiral shape, and an example of such is Vibrio cholerae. That is an example of a bacteria that has a spiral shape. So scientists will differentiate them according to shape. So when you get home, you can just draw the different kinds of shapes of the different types of bacteria. Next we have the protists. Okay, so the protists are also microscopic, which means they cannot be seen with the naked eye. Examples of protists are ciliates, diatoms, water moths, green algae, the algae that can photosynthesize, and we've got dinoflagellates, and there are many more. Right, so there are different kinds of them, and many different kinds live in water where they swim around. And how are they able to swim? Because they have special structures called flagella. And protists are plant-like. So some of them are plant-like, which means they have chlorophyll. If they have chlorophyll, which means they can produce their own food by the process of photosynthesis. Some are animal-like, which means they don't produce their own food, so they need to catch and eat their food. And some of the protists are able to swim and move around using special structures called flagella, and others have short cilia, so they are able to move and catch their own food and eat it. Okay, so that covers protists. And some of them live inside the bodies of animals and tend to cause diseases. Then we have fungi. So some fungi are microscopic, such as yeast, and others are macroscopic, such as mushrooms, meaning we can see them with the naked eye. We can see them and grab them. Mushrooms and mold, they can be seen with the naked eye. So fungi consists of filaments called hyphae, which is very useful as fungi are decomposers. So they use the fungi to absorb the food that they would have decomposed. And fungi tend to grow in dark, moist areas, in dark, moist conditions. And fungi can also cause diseases. So here is a picture of a basic structure of an organism that falls under the kingdom fungi. There is the hyphae that I was talking about. Which are filaments which help the fungi to survive. Now let's learn about the viruses. So viruses are also microscopic. We can't see them with the naked eye. We need special tools in order to see them. Right? Viruses are particles that attack the healthy cells of other living organisms. Remember, they cannot carry out the 7 life processes on their own. They cannot carry out the 7 life processes on their own. So they need a host. They need another living organism. So they attack healthy cells of other living organisms in order to carry out the life processes. So they have both characteristics of living and non-living. They have both characteristics of living and non-living, so we cannot classify them under living organisms because of that fact. An example of a virus is the influenza virus, and here is a picture just showing different illustrations of different viruses that exist on earth. We've got the HIV virus, the hepatitis B virus, the Ebola virus, adenovirus, influenza virus, the rabies virus, the bacteriophage, the papillomavirus, the rotavirus, and the herpes virus. So these are the different kinds of viruses, some of the different kinds of viruses that are found here on Earth. Now, more about viruses. So we already know that they cannot carry out the essential life processes on their own, so they need another living organism in order for them to produce and increase in numbers, increase in populations. And they also don't break down their own food, nor do they have an organized cell structure. They don't have an organized cell structure. They don't have the structures that we're learning about, the chloroplast, that help plants to photosynthesize. They don't have the mitochondria that help living organisms to respire and break down food for work. They don't have this special cell structure organelles. Now, they are only able to reproduce using materials from a host cell that they would have infected, and in this process, this type of reproduction, however, unfortunately destroys the host cell. So here's a short diagram just to show how the virus reproduces using another organism. Just a short video. So you see, it has injected some of its DNA into the living organism. Now it has used the parts inside the living organism or the host to produce its own offspring. Now it has destroyed the host. Then the same cycle continues over and over again. Now let's move on to our first activity of today. Now the first question is define the term microorganism. The second question is indicate whether each of the statements in column A applies to A only, B only, both A and B, or none of the items in column B. Write the answer in column C. Okay, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do this activity. Then after 5 minutes, we will do the corrections together. Don't forget to send in your questions or answers to the number at the bottom of the screen. So see you after 5 minutes. Welcome back, grade 8 learners. Now let's go through the corrections together. Now we needed to define the term microorganism. Now microorganisms are extremely small living organisms that cannot be seen with the naked eyes. And then indicate whether the statement in column A applies to A only, B only, both A and B, or none of the items in column B, and then write the answer in column C. So the first, we'll start off with column A1. A colony of bacteria is A, unicellular, B, multicellular. It is multicellular because within the colony there is more than one cell. So it is multicellular. And then fungi consist of filaments called a hyphae. Remember when I showed you the diagram of the fungi and how the hyphae assist the fungi in the decomposition process. And then 3, non-living microscopic particles that can cause diseases are blank. What are they? Are they bacteria? No, bacteria are living. They exhibit characteristics of living organisms. Fungi also exhibit characteristics of living organisms, so it is none of the items. The answer is actually viruses. Viruses are non-living particles. Number 4, an example of a fungus. Is it bread mold or yeast? It is actually both. Bread mold and yeast are examples of fungus. Yeast is microscopic, whereas bread mold is macroscopic. We can see it with the naked eye. I'm sure you've seen bread mold at home when your bread goes off or when it goes bad, and then bread mold starts to grow on it. And then 5, organisms that digest dead organic matter. What are they called? Vaccinations or decomposers. They are called decomposers. Remember when we're learning about different feeding relationships that exist within ecosystems, we said organisms that digest dead organic matter are decomposers. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick 2 minutes to copy down the corrections. Then after 2 minutes, we will continue with our lesson. Welcome back, grade 8 learners. Now let's move on to the second part of today's lesson, which is harmful microorganisms. Harmful microorganisms. All right. So some microorganisms, microbes, cause diseases. and these diseases may result in death. And microorganisms that cause diseases are called pathogens. They are called pathogens, and you may have heard some people calling them germs. So microorganisms that cause diseases are called pathogens. They are called pathogens. Now, these pathogens infect other organisms and cause various signs and symptoms in the organism after they have infected it. And these harmful pathogens can gain entrance in the body of the unsuspecting organism through air. So this is how you're going to get your influenza, your common cold. This is through air or food and water. If the food and water is contaminated with a pathogen, that's how they gain entrance into the body of the organism. And then contact. By contact, this can cause diseases such as TB and COVID-19. Contact could be person to person, where two people come in contact and one person is infected with the pathogen and ends up infecting the next person. Or it could be through contact between a person and an animal. When an animal bites a person, such as a dog, let's say a dog is infected with rabies and bites a human being and then transfers that pathogen to the person. So that is another way of contact. It could be through cuts and wounds. If you have a cut and the next person also has a cut and then you come into physical contact, then you can have one pathogen moving from one person to another. Or it could be through vectors. Vectors are also called carriers. So these are insects that carry pathogens and spread them around. For example, the mosquito. Some mosquitoes carry the pathogen that causes the disease malaria, and they can pass it on to human beings by biting them. So in the saliva of the mosquito, this is where you find the pathogen. Now, what are the common diseases that are caused by these microorganisms? So we've learned how they can spread or how they can invade the body of an unsuspecting host. So what are some of these common diseases that are caused by microorganisms? Right. So we know most diseases and illnesses are caused by microorganisms. We just went through COVID-19. Now, disease-causing microorganisms are almost everywhere. They could be on your table, on the doorknob, on the window handle. They are almost everywhere. Now, what we eat and drink can have thousands of microorganisms on it, and some of them might make you sick. Now, let's talk about bacteria. So, the type of bacteria that are harmful. Not all bacteria is harmful, but let's talk about the harmful bacteria. So, bacteria can cause diseases such as cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. And the name of these bacteria that cause such diseases, cholera is caused by the bacteria Vibrio cholerae. So make sure when you write down the name of a microorganism or the name of the bacteria, when you're writing it in your book, you underline it, and when you're typing it, you type it in italics. So that's how we write the names. Typhoid is caused by the bacteria Salmonella typhi, and then tuberculosis is caused by the microbacteria, and the host for these is humans are the host. Now, fungi causes a large number of diseases in plants and animals, such as, now in plants they cause rust diseases. You can see this plant here has been infected by a harmful fungi, and it is now having this disease called a rust disease. Why is it called rust disease? Because it looks like rust, so the leaves start looking like they are rusting. And they also cause fruit rot. So you may be wondering why your peach tree is always rotting. It could be as a result of a pathogen that is causing the fruit rot, and that pathogen could be bacteria. And then in animals, they cause diseases such as the ringworm. The ringworm that you often see on people's heads, and the athlete's foot. So it also can cause a disease called the athlete's foot. And viruses cause these diseases. Viruses cause common colds, influenza, AIDS, which is caused by the HIV, rabies, measles, and polio. All these diseases are caused by viruses. They are caused by viruses. Okay, so here's a picture of a family that is suffering from influenza, which has spread amongst the members of the family. So these diseases are caused by viruses. And then there are diseases caused by protozoa. Protozoa, and examples of diseases caused by protozoa are malaria, amoebic dysentery, and African sleeping sickness. So these are some of the diseases that are caused by protozoa, microorganisms called protozoa or protista. Now, let's talk about one example of a disease that is caused by a microorganism. So, it is called tuberculosis or TB. TB is caused by a bacterial infection, which means that harmful bacteria causes TB. But how does TB spread? We've spoken about how diseases spread amongst the community. It is spread through the air. TB is spread through the air. This is how TB is spread. If we've got a TB patient who is in the vicinity of a person who does not have TB, they can spread it through the air to the person who is not infected with TB. It can be, so if you have TB or you know someone who has TB, they have to cover their mouth when they sneeze, either with their elbow or with their hands, and wash their hands after coughing and sneezing. So this is how TB usually spread. So what are the symptoms of this disease? One, a cough that lasts more than a few weeks. If you have that cough that is lasting more than a few weeks, fever, night sweats, bloody phlegm, and chest pain or shortness of breath. It can also include the loss of weight. Now, how do the doctors diagnose TB? They use an X-ray to diagnose TB, and once the diagnosis has been made, then the person is going to be given a long course of antibiotics. Why antibiotics? Because TB is caused by bacteria, so they use antibiotics to treat it for 6 months. Now, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, is caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, in short, HIV. So the virus, how does it work? So the virus infects the cells of the immune system and destroy them. So the immune system's job is to fight off diseases or to fight off disease-causing pathogens. So what the HIV virus does is it attacks the immune system and destroys it. Now, after the immune system has been destroyed, then the person is left vulnerable. They no longer have a defense system, and they're no longer able to fight off normal day-to-day infections such as a common cold or diarrhea, because now they are left vulnerable. Okay, all right. Sorry, let me fix this quickly. Right, so HIV is transmitted through contact. Remember when we were learning about how diseases are passed on from person to person. So it is the contact, which is person to person contact. Contact how? Through bodily fluids such as blood or semen. So a person who is infected with HIV, then a person becomes infected with HIV through contact. There is no cure for an AIDS or HIV infection. There is no cure for an AIDS or HIV infection. The infection however, can be managed by taking medications called antiretroviral medicine, or in short, ARVs. Now, it is essential to avoid activities that may put you at risk of contracting the disease. Now, there are some persons that are at risk of contracting the disease, people that engage in, for example, unprotected sex, or it can be passed from mother to child if uh, if the mother is not taking any medication to prevent the virus from passing from mother to child, in sharing syringes. If you're in the habit of sharing syringes, you can get infected by HIV, or people who are working in healthcare are at a very high risk of contracting the disease, so they need to exercise protective measures, wear protective clothing, and blood transfusion, organ or tissue transplants. These are some places where it's very risky. So before a blood transfusion is done, the blood is screened to make sure that it doesn't have any viruses or any other pathogens in it. Then it is given to the next person. Now, let's talk about malaria. We talked about it briefly when we were talking about how diseases are spread through vectors. So malaria, the protozoa, or the disease-causing pathogen, the malaria-causing pathogen, is spread using a vector. That vector is called the Anopheles mosquito. So the Anopheles mosquito spreads the protist that causes malaria in humans, and the best treatment for malaria is not to be infected at all. So if you're going to travel to a part where malaria occurs, or where the Anopheles mosquito is found, you need to take medicines called prophylaxis before you go there or while you are there. And these medicines kill any parasites that may enter your body. So what are the symptoms of malaria? Some of the symptoms of malaria are fatigue, nausea, headache, chills, fever, vomiting, and muscle aches. All right, so now let's move on to the second activity. You need to complete the table below by filling in the missing information. So we've got columns here. We've got column 1, disease, type of organism that causes the disease and how the disease is transmitted, and symptoms of the disease. Okay, give yourself 4 minutes to quickly fill in the spaces. Then after 4 minutes, we'll do the corrections together. See you after 4 minutes. Welcome back. Now let's revise together. So we'll start off with malaria. Okay, so the name of the disease is called malaria. The type of organism that causes malaria is a protist. And how is it transmitted? How is this disease transmitted? It is transmitted by mosquitoes. And what are some of the symptoms? High fever and chills. You can also add nausea, headaches. The disease is called AIDS. What is the type of organism that causes it? It is a virus. And how is it transmitted through sexual contact? So it's contact from person to person. What are the symptoms? The immune system is destroyed, so you are left vulnerable to any other diseases out there. And then what is the name of the disease? That is caused by bacteria, and the symptoms are a cough that lasts for a few weeks. It is TB or tuberculosis, and it is spread through the air. Take 1 minute to copy down the corrections, then after 1 minute we will continue with the rest of the lesson. Welcome back. Now let's continue with our lesson. Let's learn about waterborne diseases. What are waterborne diseases? Right. So, waterborne diseases are caused by drinking contaminated water. Water contaminated with what? Water contaminated with pathogens. And they cause diarrhea, which is one of the biggest causes of child death. Severe diarrhea, this is because severe diarrhea can be dangerous, especially if you are vomiting again. You can become dehydrated, which is a very dangerous thing and can be fatal. You can become dehydrated if you don't receive medical treatment immediately, because dehydration can be fatal. It can be fatal. Now, two of the following species can cause severe diarrhea. Two of the following species can cause diarrhea. I'm going to show you a very big table. Now, we've got E. coli or Escherichia coli and Bacterium vibrio cholerae. These can cause severe diarrhea. What is the structure of these two? What is the structure of these two? Escherichia coli or E. coli is rod-shaped. What is the source of infection? If you are going to eat fruits and vegetables that are contaminated with it, uncooked meat, raw milk. So this is the source of infection. What disease do they cause? They cause diarrhea. And what are the symptoms? Stomach, muscle spasms, diarrhea, fever, and vomiting. Now moving on to Vibrio cholerae. What is its structure? It has a spiral structure. Remember when we were learning about the different shapes of bacteria? This one is spiral shaped. What is the source of infection, or where does this pathogen usually contaminate? Food and water contaminated with human feces that contain the bacteria. What disease does it cause? It causes a disease called cholera. It causes a disease called cholera. And what are the symptoms? The nausea, watery diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration, and thirst. Dehydration and thirst. Now, let's move on. So, how can we prevent infection from these diseases? Number one, wash fruits and vegetables that are going to be eaten raw. So if you're going to make that Greek salad, that has lettuce and other raw vegetables, make sure you wash them thoroughly before you eat them. Make sure you wash them thoroughly before you eat them. Now, how is an infection treated? An infection is treated with antibiotics, and steps are taken to make sure that you do not become dehydrated. For example, the salt and sugar solutions, where you add 6 level teaspoons of sugar and half a level teaspoon of salt to a liter of water. Make sure that 1 liter of water has been boiled. Make sure it has been boiled. How can we prevent further infection or infection with microorganisms? So remember, we said disease-causing organisms are almost everywhere. They're on the doorknob, they're on the table, they're on the vegetables, they're on the plates. How can we avoid being infected or prevent being infected? Because everything you're going to touch, everything you're going to eat or drink could have thousands of microorganisms on it. So it is better to prevent being infected than to treat. What are you going to do? After using the toilet, whether it's number 1 or number 2, you wash your hands thoroughly with soap and water. Refrigerate your food and keep it from spoiling. You refrigerate your food to keep it from spoiling. Don't share personal items like syringes. Don't share personal items, and practice safe sex. Cover your mouth when you cough or you sneeze with your hands or with your elbow, and boil or chemically treat water to kill any pathogens that could be in that water. And then wear gloves when you're dealing with bodily fluids such as blood. You wear gloves. Don't touch anyone's blood. Don't touch anyone's blood with your bare hands. Make sure you wear gloves. Now, scientists have worked hard to make sure that they cure the diseases that affect us as the human race, as well as our domestic animals and our pets. So modern scientists such as Louis Pasteur, Jonas Edward Salk, and Sir Alexander Fleming, they made very critical discoveries that led to new treatments and preventing of infectious diseases, such as the development of antibiotics by Sir Alexander Fleming. Louis Pasteur is best known for developing methods that prevents milk, beer, and wine from causing illnesses in humans. Pasteur showed that a microorganism growing in these liquids can make these liquids to spoil, and if people drank them, they were going to be sick because of the microorganism that is in there. So he developed a method that heats liquid to kill the microorganism called pasteurization. That's why today we have pasteurized milk, that milk that is sold in the box, and when you're in the supermarket you don't see it in the refrigerator. Instead, it is in the shelves. It is pasteurized milk. So these days, liquids such as milk, wine, beer are routinely pasteurized to make sure that they don't spoil, because if they spoil and we ingest them, they're going to make us very, very sick. So what have we learned today? Let's wrap up our lesson. So there are different kinds of microorganisms. We have, for starters, we've got viruses. These are small organisms that cannot carry out the 7 life processes. Then they depend on other organisms. We've got bacteria. These are unicellular organisms. And then we've got fungi. Examples are molds, mushrooms, and toads. So they are multicellular and unicellular. We also have protists. These ones, they are like bacteria. They are made of one cell, but they are more complex. And we also learned that a microorganism that causes a disease is called a pathogen. And how can diseases be spread? Direct contact, air, vectors, food, water contamination, cuts, and wounds. Direct contact, such as person to person or animal to person, or they can also be air, such as the droplet infection, where you're going to get a cold from the person that you are in the same vicinity with. Vectors, mosquitoes spread the protozoa that causes malaria. Food and water contamination, this is when you are going to eat or drink water that is contaminated, and then cuts and wounds, when you have an open cut and then you can get infected. So here is a homework activity. Take 1 minute to quickly copy down the questions, and then after 1 minute we will end our lesson. Welcome back, grade 8. Thank you so much for joining me in today's lesson. I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.